We are Aldea, a spiritual community for people of all kinds of faith backgrounds, or those who don't have any experience with spirituality or religion. And what connects us are values like love and open-mindedness, rather than doctrine or dogma. Our ability to create this inclusive and welcoming space is made possible through donations from people just like you. So whether you join us regularly in person or you tune into our messages from all over the place, if you enjoy what we're up to, we would so appreciate it if you'd consider giving to Aldea, whether it's a one-time gift or setting up a recurring donation. You can find more information on how to give in the description of today's episode. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope you enjoy today's message.
The definition of a paradox, or at least one definition, is when two seemingly contradicting things might actually be true at the same time. Have you ever experienced anything like this? Two seemingly contradicting things that might actually be true at the same time. I know I experience this anytime I go to a restaurant. I have the experience of being full and hungry at the same time, particularly when the dessert menu comes out. I may have eaten a whole meal, but somehow this other compartment kind of opens up and it's like, no, you can eat dessert. You can still be hungry for dessert. So it's a bit of a paradox. How about, does anyone have like that TV show that they love to hate? Like you think it's the worst TV show, but yet there's a part of you that needs to know what happens. You know, every time you walk by, maybe it's something your partner's watching, you walk by and you're like, this show is so dumb, but what are they doing? But this also goes deeper. See, there are deep emotional experiences we have where maybe emotions that we think can't coexist sometimes are put together. Like the pineapple pizza of the heart, sometimes we experience emotions that you think, how can these two go together? And yet they do. How many of us have experienced grief and joy at the same time? How many of us have been angry and yet also laughing at the same time? How many of us have felt fear and excitement kind of bundled together? I reckon that if I were to interview every single person in this whole room, we would all be able to express some kind of unique combination of emotions that we might consider challenging and emotions that we might consider therapeutic, all together, all in one. And yet what we often do when we are faced with these two seemingly opposed things, we often label it as a contradiction by saying, you know what, this doesn't fit, this is wrong, this does not work. But of course there is this other word, this more nuanced and spacious word, and that word is paradox. And so today we're going to be asking ourselves, what does it look like to walk the path of paradox, to make space within ourselves for paradox? There's an important distinction between contradiction and paradox. Often contradiction is simply masking untruth. And when contradictions are revealed, it's almost as if we're revealing some kind of dishonesty or maybe even a manipulation. There are a surprising amount of lawyers here at Aldea, and I always have to state that fact. It's great. And it seems like, from an outsider's perspective, that the job of a lawyer often is to find some contradiction, maybe within a testimony, maybe even within the law itself. Now, I think it would be really interesting for those of you who are married to a lawyer, probably find it hard to get away with things. You can't contradict yourself without them finding out. But paradox is not manipulation. Paradox is not hiding some kind of untruth. Paradox is actually often so out in the open, so truthful, that at first glance it doesn't even seem to make sense. Now, just because we're talking about paradox and contradiction today does not mean that the next time you contradict yourselves that you get the excuse, oh, it was actually just paradox, you know. Next time you're in an argument, you cannot use paradox as an out. But see, this can be really difficult for us to engage with paradox because we love certainty. We want simple answers that fit in clean boxes. This is why we love to hate on IKEA, because it's not so simple putting together an IKEA piece of furniture. We want something where the A's go with the A's and the B's go with the B's. And we like to understand, because understanding, feeling like we get it, makes us feel safe. Here's the problem. Life is not going to abide by our boxes. Life is not going to give us simple instructions. How many of us remember a time where all of our categories for life, all of the boxes, the clean, neat boxes that we had for living actually just went all out the window? See, paradox is not the end. It's actually a beginning. It's not just writing something off and saying, well, that's a mystery I'll never understand. It's actually being invited into the mystery, saying, come, let's engage with this mystery. And that moment when your categories all just flew out the window, maybe it was just that you had yet to see a bigger picture that was revealing itself. It's an invitation. If something seems to be a paradox, it has something deeper, something worth exploring. This quote comes from Roger Penrose, who is a mathematician, philosopher, scientist, and Penrose is also known for just engaging with paradox through different kinds of physics, math problems, and there's actually the Penrose triangle and the Penrose steps that are named after Roger Penrose. And this is something that we might think of as a visual paradox, in that the stairs at 90-degree angles always seem to be rising, and yet at the same time, you're not going anywhere. There's two things that seem to be true at the same time when you look at this visual paradox. Doesn't this sometimes feel how spirituality feels, looking at this diagram? Like life doesn't follow our clean paths that we want to lay out for it. Have you ever tried explaining what's going on in your life? Someone's like, hey, how are you doing? And you're kind of like, have you seen those? That's the best explanation I have. See, when we're evolving, when we're transforming, when we're growing, life is naturally going to break our boxes and break our categories. And when that happens, hopefully we start to become open to more paradox. Because our boxes, our categories, our frameworks, they can also become limiters. They can become walls that we cannot see through. Kahlil Gibran, the poet, said, "Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding." Sometimes we need that shell to break so we can see things in a larger, more expansive way. How many of us experienced a loss that we may have thought at first, well, this is going to just close me down. And yet, ironically, it actually started to open you up. It made you more spacious. Maybe you were now experiencing deeper pain, and yet at the same time, a deeper joy was also made available to you. One of my favorite words in the English language is the word bittersweet, because this word transcends both the categories of bitter and the categories of sweet. It's something new entirely. In the case of this word, 1 + 1 truly equals 3, because you're actually engaging with something larger. There's a favorite movie of mine. I don't know how many of you know what the movie this is just by looking at this. It's from the movie Inside Out. It's a fantastic film if you haven't seen it. And if you have not seen it, basically these characters are distinct emotions taking place within essentially the mind and the experience of a young girl named Riley. And each of these characters represents, an emotion such as joy, anger, sadness, and the memories of this character are all kind of specifically associated with one of these distinct categories of emotion. And yet through the film, what happens, the real transformative arc of the film, is that this character going through some difficulties, some trauma, and some transformation actually comes out on the other side discovering that life is full of complex emotions. Life is full of mixtures between these two emotions, that there are memories that don't fit into simple categories. And that is the fullness of life. As Jung says, only the paradox comes anywhere near to comprehending the fullness of life. And the spiritual traditions for thousands of years have really attested to this. Within the Zen tradition, there is a practice, and there are specifically these paradoxes called koans, in which someone who is meditating within the tradition of Zen would essentially take this riddle, this verbal or written paradox, and essentially just mull it over in their mind. And these paradoxes are not meant to be resolved. They're not really meant to make sense with human logic. An example of a very well-known koan is this. When you put two hands together, it is the sound of clapping. What is the sound of one hand clapping? We're not going to resolve that here today. It's taken people thousands and thousands of years to work through it, and it's not about coming to a clean answer. It's about allowing this paradox, this unresolvable riddle, to actually open you up and expand you. Jesus spoke often in paradoxical statements. The last shall be first. The meek are the strong. Lose your life in order to find it. That's one of my favorites. Lose your life in order to find it. Seems like it's reverse, counterintuitive, paradoxical. And yet the more we engage with it, the more it reveals to us. Yeah, you might say, well, that's great that I have the choice to engage with paradox as a way of spiritual growth. But you might say, well, Jake, you know what? Life just pushed me into paradox. It wasn't really a choice. And that's true. That's going to happen. Life is going to force us often into circumstances and experiences that aren't resolved with traditional logic, that don't fit into our clean and simple categories. I'll give you some examples. How many of us have found in our life that sometimes the kindest thing to do for another person was to tell them no? How many of us found in situations in our life that in order to create peace with another person, we actually first had to enter into some form of conflict? How many of you found that the most loving thing you could do was end a relationship? How many of you, maybe in your own hearts, have found that the strongest thing you could do was admit your own weakness? This can be especially difficult for all the men in the room. How many of you have found that the wisest thing you can do is actually admit to and embrace your own unknowing? And lastly, how many of you have experienced that staying true to something might actually mean leaving it? I know many of us, this has been our experience of some form of faith. I know when I look at my own life and I look at my upbringing within evangelical Christianity, what I really wanted, especially growing up, was I just wanted to get it. I wanted to get life. I wanted to understand how do things work? What is the thing that is going to make everything make sense? And my faith upbringing gave me that. It gave me clean answers. It showed me that, at least at the time, that I was on the right path, that I was doing things the way they ought to be done. That was how I experienced things growing up. How many of you could look back at some point in your life where you would have said, yeah, I get how the world works, and I'm pretty much doing things the right way? We all have moments like that. But whether or not we make the choice, we are going to be thrust into paradox. And I'd venture to say that many of you are here because those simple answers, those clean boxes, didn't work anymore, and you needed to move beyond them. And so for me, something that I found was that when I moved beyond certainty, yes, it was scary. Yes, there was fear. But as I began to embrace uncertainty, I also found myself becoming more open, becoming more connected to other people, becoming more free. And the paradox of that experience is that all those things that I just mentioned, those are all the things that I was promised by my tradition. You know, I was promised that if you just stay true to this tradition, you will have a connection to God, you'll have a sense of freedom, you'll have a sense of peace. And yet, paradoxically, I found all those things by being willing to step outside of my tradition. When we think of this idea of staying true to something, a word that often comes to mind is the word orthodox. Ortho meaning right, aligned. This is the word when you think of orthopedic surgeon. And dox means way of thinking or popular opinion. So orthodox at its most basic etymology just means right thinking. And when we think of this in terms of religion, we often think of an orthodox religious person as someone who strictly abides by the tradition and the laws of their religion. And paradox, para, the word, that root essentially means outside of or distinct from. So distinct from the normal way of thinking. And what's interesting is paradox isn't necessarily the same thing as unorthodox. It's not just a rejection of the orthodox. It's being willing to adopt a wholly different perspective. See, friends, there is a time for the orthodox. How many of you, if you were going in for open heart surgery, you wouldn't want to hear your surgeon say to you, I'm not really orthodox. I don't really like doing things the way that everyone else does it. I kind of like just getting in there and doing my own thing, just improvising. No, you wouldn't want to hear that. How many of you, if you were having someone build you a house, you wouldn't want to hear them say, my style, the way I lay foundations, again, it's not really, I don't like doing it the way, have you heard of the Penrose steps? That's more my vibe, So there's a time for the orthodox, but there is also a time when orthodoxy no longer works. There is a time where we are just doing things the way we have always done them because it's the way we've always done them. And how many of us could look out to our world today, to things like politics, medicine, even religion, and say, look at all these things that are being done just because it's the way it's always been done. Why aren't we challenging these things? Why aren't we looking at a new way and a new perspective? Because what often happens is we can turn orthodoxy into a loyalty to tradition versus seeking after what that tradition has always pointed to. There are a lot of versions of Christianity out there that I think are more loyal to the religion than they even are interested in seeking after the way that Jesus lived. And that's just something I choose to speak to you because that's the tradition I grew up in. I'm sure that people who grew up in different religious traditions could speak to that going on in theirs. And it reminds me of these words from the author Peter Rollins, and this comes from his book, The Orthodox Heretic. And he says, we must question the difference between the heresy of orthodoxy, in which we dogmatically claim to have the truth, and orthodox heresy, in which we humbly admit that we are in the dark, but still endeavor to live in the way of Christ as best we can. Of course, you can just translate this to, we still endeavor to live in the way of love or the way of peace as best we can. But what's fascinating to me about this quote is that there are those who dogmatically hold to tradition and yet in doing so are abandoning the heart of it. This is what he calls the heresy of orthodoxy. And yet, at the same time, there are those who are willing to abandon certainty, who are willing to abandon dogma, and yet maybe in doing so are actually honoring the heart of their tradition. Maybe they're finding a true orthodoxy, what he calls orthodox heresy. See, it's important to remember, friends, Jesus was considered a heretic. This is why he was killed. So was Galileo. So was Martin Luther. So was Martin Luther King. These are different people who challenged the way that things were done. They asked, have we lost the plot here? Are we just doing things because that's the way we've always been doing them, and yet we've lost the plot? How many of us found that the more we question tradition, the more life, hope, and vitality we actually begin to experience? See, there's a difference between rejecting the orthodox and moving from the orthodox into paradox. It can be very easy to move from one orthodoxy into another. Forgive me, I have to use this metaphor because I feel like if I don't talk about college basketball at least once a month, I'm going to get in trouble by someone, and I don't know who. But I imagine there are plenty of Arizona Wildcat fans out there in the room today. There we go, bear down. But also in Tucson, there are many transplants, many people who come from other states, other cities, and I can only imagine that for some of you, when you moved to Tucson, your loyalty, your college basketball or college football loyalty belonged to another team, and yet you moved here and you realized, I need to get with the program. And like me, you just instantly switched your loyalties. But see, the problem is, friends, we do this all the time in all kinds of different ways. And one way that I personally have just seen a lot of, and I'm really familiar with, is doing this in the context of religion. There are a lot of people who maybe have an experience of living out a really fundamentalist, maybe an orthodox experience of religion. And when they reject that, they tend to move into a fundamentalist experience of something like atheism, or a fundamentalist version of an entirely different type of spirituality. And see, what I think is happening in those circumstances is that you are centered in something and you experience briefly a decentering, and as quickly as possible you recenter yourself in order to find grounding again. Which I understand, which is totally natural and normal. But the path of paradox is actually one where we are allowing ourselves to live decentered. To live, as Peter Rollins would say, in the dark. And yet in that liminal space, we find a spaciousness, we find a love, we find an expansive sense and experience of our own hearts. This is why I love this simple quote: we transcend and we include. We don't just reject where we came from. We move into a new perspective that has space for all of it. How many of you, if someone were to ask you what your faith or spirituality looks like now, you might give an answer that is along the lines of a both and type of answer. Both and. How many of you, if someone were to ask you, do you believe in God or do you not believe in God, you would say something like, both and. Yes. I know when people ask me, is Aldea a church or is it not a church? I usually say, yeah. See, friends, I believe that through the both ands of life, we can actually have our cake and eat it too, but we have to be comfortable with the paradox of it. See, we need the both ands of life. How many of you are tired of the either or type of polarity that we are experiencing right now in our world? You're either for us or you're against us. I'm over it. And paradox actually invites us into a more non-dual way of living. See, the duality of life is not serving us anymore. We need something a little more non-dual. So the path of paradox is one where we move away from certainty into spaciousness, where we allow things to coexist that don't always make sense side by side. Speaking of dessert, not too long ago, I had at a restaurant celery ice cream, okay? And I know what you're thinking. It was one of the best desserts I've ever had. You gotta let things coexist sometimes that don't make sense. You gotta be open. I want to end with this. From Brene Brown: the mark of a wild heart is living out the paradox of love in our lives. It's the ability to be tough and tender, excited and scared, brave and afraid, all in the same moment. It's showing up in our vulnerability and our courage, being both fierce and kind. This path of paradox and this paradox of love is that it invites us into a way of being that is going to expand us beyond our comfort zone. When I think about our motto as a community, love period, the more I think about it, the more I realize it's not always going to be easy. It's not always going to fit into clean, simple boxes. Sometimes it might be the most challenging thing. And yet I believe that it is so worthwhile. So Aldea, may we walk the path of paradox. May we realize that the breaking of our boxes is not an end, it's actually a beginning. May we embrace the both ands of life and find in them a fullness. And may we be unafraid to move beyond the orthodox and yet find what we were looking for all along.